Good afternoon, dear participants. It's a great pleasure to welcome you in the one of the parallel session of the second International Conference on Water, Megacities and Global Change entitled Technical and Technological Solution 1 on 2. The session chair is Mrs. Régis Moiron, who is a professor at the Université de Paris-Est Créteil, Les. Mr. Moiron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, François, for this presentation. As said, I'm Régis Moiron, researcher at Les, a research lab dealing with the issues of water in urban areas. My playground is Paris. As no one is perfect, I'm a chemist, and I will be leading this first session, as mentioned by François. The four presentations of this session focus on how cities can adapt to climate change, and they will give us an insight on the correlation between poverty and access to water in Egypt, on solution on how to cooling public spaces in Paris, on nature-based solution for a sustainable stormwater management, and finally, a comparison between two cities with respect to water stress adaptation. Just before we start this session, some practical information. First, I will ask a speaker to respect the allotted time so that we can keep time to answer the question at the end of the first presentation. For the attendance, if you have any question about the presentation, I will ask you to post them on the chat. I will relay them during the Q&A session that will follow right after the last presentation. So let's start with our first speaker. Ala Beyoumi is a research engineer at the CNRS National Center for Scientific Research and head of the Digital Humanities Cluster at the CEDEJ. She holds a PhD in computer science and applied mathematics and an habilitation in geography from University Jean Moulin. And she was the winner of the CNRS 2015 Crystal Medal and ambassador of the program La Science Taille XXL. The floor is yours. Hala.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm pleased to be with you today, and I should like to thank Mr. Moiron for his kind introduction. I'm here today to try and answer this question, which is, does the lack of access to water have an effect on poverty? This is the result of a joint work with Marie-Françoise Burel, Directress of Studies at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, and who unfortunately couldn't join us today. This is a summary here on the screen of my intervention. I will start by trying to explain why this study was conducted, what we study exactly, how this research was carried out, and then I will try to present conclusions which should answer our main question for today. And I will end with a brief conclusion. Why was this study conducted? Well, for two main reasons. First of all, water is the key element of life. Ever since antiquity, people have moved around the major rivers to give rise to the greatest civilizations. And then we looked at the curious case of Egypt. Egypt is almost like a square, a desert square, hardly, or at least quite soft, and it is next to the Red Sea. The Sinai mountain is a slope at the Arabo-African area between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. Most of the territory on Egypt is made up of plateaus. Unfortunately, the sound of the speaker has been interrupted. Over 98% of the population, unfortunately, the speaker can no longer be heard. The sound of the speaker is interrupted. The destiny of the valley is at the heart of the Egyptian identity, as Herodote used to say. Egypt is a gift of the Nile. However, one can wonder if this is still true. The urban planning of these countries is going to change the situation in terms of access to water. Egypt currently is not in a situation of lack of water. It's provided for at 55,000 cubic meters thanks to the Nile. However, it is important to be aware of the future. The population is growing at over 90 million inhabitants in 2016 and almost 101 million inhabitants today. The use of water in Egypt is used in households, industrial, navigation, irrigation, and the use is currently at 65.5 billion cubic meters of water. In 2030, the country will reach a level of extreme scarcity, which the presence of the Nile tends to undermine. It supplies for over 70% of the needs of water. The consumption per capita is at 699 cubic meter in 2015. According to the FAO, this level should reach below the threshold of 500 cubic meters by 2030, which would put the country in a situation of water stress. Egypt has a reserve of 64 billion per year, thanks to the Nile, as well as groundwater and reuse of agriculture water. 95% of the water consumed in Egypt comes from the Nile, whereas Egypt is one of the river countries. It's one of the major users of Nile water, as well as the states further upstream. A national society, a holding society for water and used water, was created in 2004, and an Egyptian Water Regulatory Agency was created, the EWRA. It was created in 2006. 26% of the population lives under the poverty threshold. Now, what are we studying? The link between poverty and the lack of water. This is a hypothesis, but our study is not based on observations or hypotheses, but on an appropriate mathematical analysis. A UN 2009 report reveals that the installation of sanitation and drinking water in the poorest countries is the safest way of reducing poverty and improving public health. Is it really true? These two maps seem to show that there is almost no correlation between poverty and lack of water resources, which is why it is essential to explain how we conducted our study. It all started when the Social Fund asked the Population Council, International Population Council, as well as the CEDEJ, to study poverty in Egypt and to draw the very first map of poverty in the country. The methodology was based on the methodology proposed by Davis in 2002 to draw a map of poverty in the world. It gives us a first overview of the distribution of poverty. The index in this study is based on the criteria consumption per capita. The data that's used are based on 47 variables: the size of the family, percentage of illiteracy, access to water. 16 of these indicators show positive or negative correlations with the poverty index. As you can see, this map was drafted at the most granular level of the country, either villages for rural areas or neighborhood for the urban areas. The mapping of this system is a dynamic interactive tool which helps us calculate in real time the evolution at different scales and different places. Such a tool allows us to regularly update the follow-up of spatial evolutions of poverty. This method can be used in other countries, which would allow us to compare in depth the link between poverty and access to water worldwide. Poverty is more a proof of access to drinking water for part of humanity than the rarity, the scarcity of sources themselves. Statistics and mathematics got together to show simultaneously the space and the abstract phenomenon in order to better visualize them. A technological evolution in this area is underway, as well as the evolution of scientific systems and methods, which use computer systems and the various programming languages. Modeling and the work of geographs, as well as what they allow in terms of spatial analyses, namely used with this tool should allow us to better understand the environment. Let us remember the importance of statistics as well, namely with these tools of analysis and forecasting. So on programming interactive tools, we have access to spatial information. This can be summarized as follows: the automatic modification of mapping based on the needs, based on a real-time calculation, the possibility of a 3D representation, visual as well as sound animations. We should like to insist specifically on the easiness and the user-friendliness of these systems. This should be made available for a wider public, specialists, administrations, any user who could be easily in a situation to use them. We here have the ARCEAU example, the poorest governorate of Egypt, and on the other map, the system recalculates the variable only in SOAG so that we can see the situation specifically at the governorate level. Another example, Atalia in the Delta of Egypt, with a national-wide study. And this shows in the second map the situation of the city at the governorate. Now let's look at the actual results. The study showed a correlation that's extremely concerning between access to drinking water and poverty. As you can see here, the map of poverty and the map of distribution of water in the Aswan city are almost identical. Another example is that of the city of Fayoum on the right hand of the slide, which is also very, very similar. Now, we decided that our study should not be limited to that, and we decided to dig deeper. In 2010, we used the exact same methodology in order to conduct the same study based on the latest data of the previous year, after having simulated the poverty from 2006 to 2004. The evolution of the poverty map between 1996 and 2006 was all the more concerning that the economic state of certain cities and districts improved in the meantime with the implementation of an increasing number of water projects in these areas. In 2006, a group of 127 villages of the governorate of Shekia went above the poverty line from 1996 to 2006. This is explained by 37 projects of hydraulic planning with a production of 475,000 cubic meters per day, as well as drainage and infrastructures. Another map, Dakalia, 93 villages went above the poverty line, thanks namely to sewage systems. We use stochastic pre-topology, which is operationalized by a platform of multi-agent system. This multi-agent simulation adds to the methodology it comes from, namely microsimulation, programming approaches, object-oriented programming approaches, and other parameters that are hardly ever used and are very useful in geography and geographic studies. The development of new tools and the specific computerized analyses are never to be separated from the research by scientifics and social scientists. It is clear that this pluridisciplinary aspect is the key to improving research in human systems, and their functioning is increasingly complex. Many thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, right in time. So as I said, I'm checking if there is any question on the chat, but the question will be asked at the end of the last presentation. So we'll move to the next presentation, which will be given by two speakers, Julie Roussel and Anita Ravlik. Julie Roussel is a PhD in urban and spatial planning and an environmental psychologist by training. She is an associate researcher at Lab Urba, and her research focuses on active mobility and the use of public space in dense urban areas. Anita Ravlik is in charge of steering the circular economy at the Paris City Hall. And now I give us the floor.
Bonjour à toutes et tous. Donc effectivement, nous allons
Good
faire
afternoon, everyone. We are indeed going to make this presentation together. we prepared it across two different directorates or divisions of the city of Paris. Anita Havlik is in charge of international communication at the Museum of Sewers at the Division of Property and Water. As for myself, I'm in charge of the Department for Adaptation to Climate Change and the direction of ecological transition and climate. So this slide is for context. The effects of climate change can be seen in Paris, just like everywhere else. And in the case of Paris, we have been able to observe an increase in average temperatures, which has been quite marked over the past few decades. You can see from the graph here where things stand. This is taken from a study we published in 2021 across the territory of Paris. We've already seen a 2.3 degree increase since the beginning of the industrial era. And this is made more pronounced by the urban heat island effects, which are even more perceptible in Paris than some of the surrounding municipalities. And on particularly hot nights, there is up to 8 degrees of difference between, say, Paris and the Rambouillet area in the distant suburbs. So that heat is the leading risk, not just for the population, but also for the infrastructures in Paris. We have therefore embarked on a fresher or cooler Paris plan, which is fairly ambitious. I'm going to be, we are rather going to be talking about three major ways that we can try to control problems with heat. First of all, using water. Secondly, using greenery. And thirdly, using a somewhat more innovative approach, using shadow and shade and deliberately creating artificial shade. But I'm going to hand over to my colleague for the next slide. Indeed, so among the tools that we have to enable the city to adapt, we came up with the Paris Pluie plan, the Paris rainwater plan. That sounds a little bit like umbrella or parapluie. And this enables us to implement strategies that can shift the model of Paris as a city from one which is primarily waterproof to one which is, to a large extent, permeable. And this enables water to become a much more useful element for the city rather than to be a risk factor. And this is in the context of a drainage system which provides both for the collection of effluents from households and rainwater or stormwater, which means that there can be particularly huge amounts of water circulating through the system when major storms occur. And also in the context, as I was mentioning, of a city with many mineral surfaces, so that when it does rain, not only do we have considerable amounts of water going into the drainage system, into the drains, but we also, or the sewers, but we also have all of this impermeability, which means that we're not able to take advantage of the rainwater. So the way that we have been trying to remedy this as part of the Paris Pluie plan is by mapping different areas of Paris depending on the underground characteristics, the subsurface characteristics, and looking at both built areas and outside areas, which could be roads, gardens, and so forth, and to try to see how some rainwater can actually be used for aerial averaging rather than simply flushed into the sewers. And you can see here the way that we have color-coded depending on how much absorption is possible. We are able in this way to calculate figures for water aerial averaging. So we have measures that have been taken as soon as you exceed a limit of 20 square meters of new construction. You have to conform with a series of steps to check whether you are in line or not with applicable standards. So on this slide, you can see the way that we work to come up with all kinds of solutions. This, of course, has a lot to do with greening. And you can see the solutions could have to do with, for example, grassy paving or cobblestones. There could be green facades on buildings. It's also possible to install structures inside blocks of buildings and to make changes in the way that public or street areas are used. So on the next slide here, we can see the bathing in the Seine River project. And this involves being able to ultimately organize swimming in the Seine as part of the Olympics. So we have been working with this bathing in the river project to enable people to take ownership of city water. Once again, it can be about sports, but it can also be about cooling down in this context of global warming and high temperatures. In this way, we can make sure that the river is not just used for economic or business purposes or as a landscape feature, but also enables Parisians to go swimming. It's a governance issue as well. There are some 20 or indeed 30 different players who are part of a memorandum of understanding around this project. It's also about finding new ways to work across the whole surrounding territory to improve water quality, which is crucial, of course, to whether it's possible or not to go swimming in the river, so that all the upstream and downstream players have to combine their efforts to avoid effluents being released untreated into the water, and we have to keep very close checks on all pollutants that might be released into the river. And this brings us back to the notion of a natural space and also to the idea of shared cooperative governance to achieve this purpose of quality water. So we have a goal of 2025 for bathing in the Seine River with 3 sites that have already been identified. We had an experiment in not the river itself, but one of the canals of Paris at La Villette, as you can see here. This was a pilot experiment in 2017, which proved very successful. A lot of Parisians have taken to going swimming in the city, and were able to keep tabs on water quality. We have 3 or 4 years of hindsight now with opening up this facility during the summer season, and we have not had any problems with water quality so far, which we find very encouraging, as also is the very large number of visitors who came to cool down and go for a swim in this spot. But I'm going to hand back to Julie now. Thank you, Amita. So we have seen that water can offer a whole gamut of different solutions, different ways of contributing to cooling the city. Another area that the city of Paris has been working actively with has to do with plants, with greening some of its buildings, public buildings and public spaces. We have a fairly ambitious program that has been rolled out since 2014. And as part of the new phase of this program, which began last year and comes to an end in 2026, a number of new initiatives have been taken in terms of greening, which in fact tie in many ways with water management. So I've only listed the main ones here. It's about enabling the concept of planted streets, which are fully planted along the buildings wherever possible, along walls and facades, but also on the ground, along the pavements and in the ground. You may have heard of the major efforts we've been making in the build-up to 2026, by when 170,000 additional trees will have been planted, and we will have a number of additional new urban forests, adding to the 2 woods that we already have, the Bois de Boulogne and the Bois de Vincennes, as things currently stand. To add to what Anita was saying earlier, 100 hectares of public space will be freed of tarmac to enable better absorption of rainwater, first of all, and also to promote development of biodiversity. Another very key measure that we are taking, but of course Paris is not the only one doing this, although we're taking it up enthusiastically, is turning schoolyards, and the schoolyards, in fact, of kindergartens quite soon, into cool oases where people can find comfort when it is hot. So all of these approaches enable us to gradually build up a network of cool islands. There are currently 1,200 of these across the territory of Paris, and we're constantly adjusting and improving this approach. The idea being to deliver a whole range of different benefits while strengthening biodiversity, as I mentioned. So on the next slide, we can see another resource that is fairly underused as things currently stand in Paris, that is shade. And so we have been trying to take deliberate steps to build ultimately into a shade plan in Paris. It's a very effective way to combat the problem of heat islands in the cities and to make it more comfortable for the people who are using these spaces, who may be passers-by or who might be spending a little longer in these spaces. So we try, of course, whenever possible, to take advantage of the natural shade provided by trees. But as we know, there are many places in Paris for a number of different reasons that have to do sometimes with the nature of the subsoil, where it is not possible to plant trees. And in such cases, we can come up with such solutions as these large-scale shaded areas. So we started working on the shadow plan, the shade plan in 2020, and we came up with a number of different solutions. In the picture in the middle of this slide, you can see a shaded area, a shade providing structure. It doesn't look too good. It wasn't so much about aesthetics at this stage. Rather, we wanted to put the concept to the test and test this particular canvas, which really showed its worth with a 15-degree differential between the shaded and unshaded areas. Next slide. I'd like to turn to a subject which is not technical as such. We were just, talking about climate change and about heat waves. And of course, prior requirement in the face of this is to adapt infrastructures in the relevant territory, in this case, the Paris area. But the ultimate challenge has to do with behavioral change, because it is our lifestyle, our day-to-day practices, our day-to-day culture, which will have to change. And this is true both at the individual and at the collective level. In order to support these lifestyle changes, the Paris municipality has been working to develop tools to heighten awareness with, of course, the Cool Islands map, for one thing, but also initiatives that enable ordinary citizens to take part in their own way in various initiatives. For example, we have the climate volunteers that you see in the middle here, which are part of the climate volunteers, but also of the Climate Academy that you see on the right here, a school which is open to all, and where the younger segment of the population in particular can learn about some of the things that climate change, with a number of different training or information sessions which are provided. These are the kinds of tools that will enable us to bring about the kinds of social environmental change that we very much hope will materialize through adapting our infrastructures, but also our lifestyles. Thank you for your attention. I think that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you for this presentation and the feedback of Paris. So we'll move to the next presentation that will be given by Marcus Nobrega Gomez Jr. Marcus is a dual degree PhD candidate at the University of Texas at San Antonio and the University of Sao Paulo. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's degree in hydraulic engineering and sanitation. Marcus has expertise in fully distributed hydrological and hydrodynamic models, stormwater quality models, and low impact development modeling. Because we experiment some issues with the connection, the internet connection with Mexico, we will listen to the recording presentation from Marcus.
Hi, my name is Marcus. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at San Antonio and the University of Sao Paulo. This is my paper. This is entitled Nature-Based Solutions for Sustainable Stormwater, a Model Approach and a Sensitivity Analysis for Bioretention Design using GreenAMP and Reservoir Routing. I'd like to say thanks to my co-authors, Talita, Tassiana, Marina, Marcio, and Eduardo from University of Sao Paulo and University of Texas at San Antonio. And in general, this particular paper, we developed a bioretention model that we're going to show how we can use that to design bioretention systems. So in this first slide, I want to show a quick summary of this particular research. So basically, the stormwater management in urban centers, we have several problems to manage, like climate change and urbanization. And these problems are relatively complex to model. And if we want to do better designs, we need to address these issues. Another important approach that we have been recently developing is the concept of nature-based solutions. So they are solutions that are in the contrast of gray infrastructure. So we're looking for bioretention roofs, we're looking for green roofs, we're looking for permeable pavements, and these particular solutions, they aim to store the water instead of releasing this water quickly, and therefore we increase some hydrological benefits when we do that. However, we don't have a very clear standard for design in Brazil. So in this study, we present a hydrological model for bioretention systems, and we are considering bioretention systems as one special case of nature-based solutions. We apply this model and we show a sensitivity analysis identifying the main uncertainties that should be considered to assess the impacts of changing conditions as rainfall and catchment impervious rates. And this model was applied in São Carlos, Brazil. We're going to show some of the results, and we're going to show how the model works, what are the parameters that we need, and so on and so forth. Before going straight to the model itself, I want to show a little bit of motivation for the application of hydrological models for floods. As I mentioned, climate change is one of the main challenges that we're going to face in the next decades. So, for example, in the United States in 2005 and in 2017, we had spectacular hurricanes like Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Harvey. And these particular events are, results of not only climate change but also urbanization, and we need to face these problems in the next decades. And one way to attack this particular problem is to, imagine the watershed as a system composed of several different types of nature-based solutions in order to decrease the flood risks. Okay, let's just take a quick look in the impact of flooding. Floods are the costliest natural disaster. This is like a very spectacular thing, and we have at least $1 trillion in flood damages between 1980 and 2003 worldwide. So all this money spent to, pay flood damage, not only considering the fatalities, right? Because we had hundreds of thousands of fatalities in the last centuries due to flooding. And when we plan the new cities, when we plan the new environmental and built and natural environments, when we do that, our ultimate goal is to shift the probability distribution function to a past where we can have smaller flood events. So if we do not take any control, if we keep urbanization, and if climate change really occurs and we have this particular flood distribution of probability, and we want to shift this particular distribution function to the past or even to a scenario with less flood magnitude. So that's our ultimate goal with, designing stormwater systems as natural-based solutions. Well, this is two particular images that shows the adaptation is actually required. So in this figure here in the left, we can see the increasing in precipitation for extreme events in the United States. So we see that in the coastal areas, especially in the coastal areas, we have increases of 30 to 40% in the particular extreme events. So, we need to have better facilities to uptake this increasing in climate change, and also associated with climate change, we have the pollution problem that we need to address. So we need to adapt to these particular events. So the goal of this particular study is to present a flexible design method for bioretention cells, and that we can use for different land uses, and we can use for different rainfall patterns. So in order to do that, we applied this model in a subtropical climate weather in the southern part of Brazil. And our ultimate goal here for the design was to have outflows smaller than the pre-development flow conditions. So we want to make sure that the outflow of the bioretention system is smaller than a particular threshold that we're going to estimate. And to do that, we developed a software called TC Hydro, and this model is freely available on GitHub. Here's a link to download this model, and we apply this model in the Brazilian catchment. Let's take a look in the model development, right? So the model it consists actually in a set of different synthetic models, like for example, for the watershed, we can simulate the hydrographs, the inflow hydrographs using the soil conservation service curve number method. And for the bioretention system itself, we can estimate the infiltration using the GreenAmp model. And to propagate the inflow hydrograph to the outlet, we can use the level pool routing approach. So basically here in this particular chart, it shows like a little bit of the parameters that we need in the model. We need to define the time step, the GreenAmp properties, some hydrological parameters for the watershed, so on and so forth. And then we perform a flow routing, which is basically the solution of the water balance equations using some auxiliary tables. And the ultimate goal here is to have a peak flow, actually an outflow peak smaller than the pre-development flow. So that's what we're looking for. And then finally we can do the design and the drawings of the system. Okay, in this particular slide, we show the main flow conditions that we can have in the bioretention model. So in this particular left-hand side here of this figure, we can see the main layout of the bioretention system with the main inputs and outputs. So the DC Hydro model can simulate bioretentions with exfiltration through the lateral and the bottom of the bioretention system. We can have an underdrain, and also we can have internal water storage, even though it's not presented here, but we can have an internal water storage. In this particular system, we have a pounding zone where the water can be stored, and we allow the slowly infiltration after the peak of the inflow, for example. So we have some parameters like the elevation of the weir, like the gravel layer, the soil media, and we also have like precipitation happening at the top of the bioretention system, as well as evapotranspiration. And here in the left-hand side, we have some of the flow conditions that actually can occur in the bioretention system. So depending on the volume of the particular storm events, we can have different flow conditions. We can classify the flow conditions into Ortonian flow conditions and Dunnian flow conditions. In the particular cases where the infiltration capacity is smaller than the inflow capacity, we have Ortonian flow conditions. Take a look here in the case E, for example. We have more inflow rate compared to the infiltration capacity, so we start to have a pounding depth here, and eventually we can have like outflow through the weir. So we can have different combinations between inflow events and infiltration capacity, such that we can have this particular flow conditions here, right? And this is important because the equations, the system of equations can change according to the flow conditions. We applied the model in the University of São Paulo, São Carlos School of Engineering in the campus too. And here's a quick map showing the watershed. This is in the state of São Paulo in Brazil. We are basically capturing water of a rooftop. This is basically 100 square meters rooftop, and then we deviate this flow to the bioretention system, and we have a relatively strong precipitation pattern with very intense storms in January. And some of the parameters that we had here is we assume a curve number 98. We estimate the pre-development flow conditions as 0.9 liters per second. And here are the other parameters. All these parameters were calibrated with observed events in the year of 2019. So here is the layout of the bioretention system that we are modeling here, right? So we basically have a rooftop. We have an inspection well where we can take a look if we have some debris or if we have some coarse material that we can clean before going to the system. We have here is number 3, here's the inlet of the bioretention system, and then we have the 6 square meters bioretention system, and finally this water goes to the receptor system in the downstream of the bioretention. All right, so here are some of the main results that we tested in this particular study. And so what we did here is, okay, we changed the bioretention area, each 0.5 square meters, from 0.5 to 10 square meters, and we assessed the sensitivity of the outlet hydrograph. So here in Brazil, we have a standard that says that we need to design stormwater systems for micro drainage for 10-year storms. So here we have a 10-year storms. Here is the effective precipitation and the inflow hydrograph. These are results using the Soil Conservation Service method for the rooftop. And here you can see the colors of the system. And in this black dashed line here is the pre-development flow conditions. And we can see that some of the bioretention cells, they had larger outflows compared to the pre-development flow conditions. So in other words, larger bioretention areas like 10 square meters, 9.5 or 9, they provided a large outflow compared to some of the other cases. For example, here 5 square meters seems to be relatively optimal for the 1 liter per second, right? So that indicates that increasing the bioretention area does not necessarily decrease the peak flow, actually can also increase the peak flows. And what happened here is like a layout showing the solution that we had in the field. We had a 6 square meters bioretention system, which means 3 by 2, and looking to the plant view. So as you can see, for this particular event, we have like the water level in the 45 centimeters here, and then it goes up, and then we have a little bit of pounding here, and then the system starts to release water, so we can visualize this. And we also can take a look at the infiltration rates and the inflow rates and compare them. So you can see that the difference between these two curves here is the pounding that we have in the system. So just to summarize and provide final remarks, we developed a new bioretention model that can be used to enhance the hydrological performance of bioretention systems. So we basically can estimate how is the outlet hydrographs of a particular bioretention system without requiring a lot of data, right? We just basically need some information of the infiltration capacity of the system, like the saturated hydraulic conductivity, which is a physically based parameter, right? We can also estimate the watershed inflow hydrograph using a simple parameter as the curve number, right? And so the parameters used in this particular model are relatively easy to be estimated. And we can estimate that using these properties for the watershed and for the bioretention system. The model is able to determine hydrographs, and one can use this model in optimization problems. Like you can define what is the optimal area for a specific hydrograph that you want to mitigate. You can just use solver. The model is developed in Excel, so you just can use solver to determine this particular area, or you can do trial and error, just changing the dimensions of the system such that you have this optimal area. You can use that. And the model is flexible enough to be applied for different catchment scales. Here in this particular study, we applied for a rooftop, but you can either use a watershed. You can also input your inflow hydrograph from SWIM, for example, for HEC-HMS, for example, and then use this particular model just to study how the bioretention reacts to this particular inflow hydrograph you want to test. And we need to provide more testing and more calibration and validation, and also comparison with this model with other models. As I mentioned, like SWIM, for example, this is obviously wanted. Thank you again for being part of this conference. This is a pleasure to me to present for you. And here is my email address. If you have any questions about the model, about how to get the model, please let me know. I'm totally open to talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this presentation. I hope during the question the internet connection will be better. Last but not least presentation will be given by Michel Laforgue. Michel Laforgol's hydraulic engineer diploma and a PhD in lake water modeling from the Mine School in Paris, France. He's been working all around the world as a consultant for more than 30 years, both on urban water, drinking water, sanitation and treatment, but also on the environment as far as water is concerned. He is currently a project director and expert at Suez Consulting, and is also the president of the Science of the Earth and Living department of the French Water Academia, and professor in several engineering schools and one university. Michel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You hear me?
Yes.
Oui. Bon, je vais peut-être le faire en français puisqu'il y a plusieurs.
Well, perhaps I could do this in French, says the speaker. Since we've had a number of presentations in French already, I wanted to talk about water stress and the effects that this has in cities and what we can do about it. Well, it seems that one of the slides has been skipped, but oh, there it is. Great. Perfect. Thank you. So the first question is to look at the current situation, how things might evolve over time. Currently, there are a number of cities around the world which are temporarily or in a lasting way suffering from water stress. So the question then is, what will happen with the impact of climate change in this respect? Is it possible to look ahead, to take advance action to provide for better resilience? And finally, what can we do if there is a sudden shutdown of water provision in the cities? What are the kinds of measures that we can take in such a scenario? So in the next part of the presentation, we're going to look, first of all, at how Cape Town managed its water supply before the very dire water crisis that hit it at the end of 2017, the beginning of 2018. We'll be looking at some of the basic facts and features of Cape Town and what can be learned from its experience for other cities. Then we will talk about the Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, the city of Windhoek, then not so far from South Africa, of which has a long-term experience of water stress, and what are some of the steps that can be taken to try to remedy this problem, or at least to alleviate it. And we will be looking at all of this in the context of climate change and looking at what all of this might imply for cities around the world. So first of all, Cape Town, 4 million, a population of 4 million, an affluent city, but with also informal habitat in some districts, water demand, which varies markedly depending on the season, depending on temperature, but also on rainfall. And we have variability that ranges from 700,000 to 1.2 million cubic meters per day, with a mean of 900,000 cubic meters. Water resources are made up primarily of 6 huge dam reservoirs with a total capacity of 900 million cubic meters. And it's interesting to note that effectively this means 1,000 days of water demand stored in these reservoirs. And that would lead an observer to think that there was adequate capacity to act as a buffer in times of drought, during relatively dry years, and that you would then be able to fill the reservoirs back up during a subsequent rainy year, so that a dry year would not be particularly problematic. But things did not turn out that way. On this graph, you can see changes over the space of about 10 years with the fill rates of these 6 large dam reservoirs. And you can see that we're between 0 and 100, a little more than 100%. And progressively over time, there has been an erosion in the percentage full. It goes up and down, of course, on a yearly basis, but initially it was returning to about 100%. But if you look at what started to occur in about 2014, with the drop during the dry season, which continued, we did no longer see the kind of refilling performance that had been observed during previous years, so that the peaks had dropped from 100 to 75%, 60%, and ultimately less than 40% at the end of 2017. That dotted line that you see there, the dashed line, was the forecast of the authorities at the time. It was fairly catastrophic. They expected the reservoirs to be completely empty before the end of the dry season and the beginning of the rainy season in 2018. They felt that essentially the whole system was going to go bankrupt and there would be no water at all for the 4 million inhabitants. So it was a substantial crisis, and they took some very stringent measures. These consisted primarily of restricting agricultural and industrial use. That's approximately cutting them down to half of where they would normally stand. Then restricting household consumption with a ban on filling swimming pools or irrigating gardens. This is something you often see around the world. But there was also a quota per capita per day, and that's less common. Initially, that was 87 liters per person per day. Then later, it went down to 50 liters per person per day, with checks which were carried out of household consumption and fines, which were quite substantial if necessary. There were also pressure reducers installed so as to limit a loss of water, but also quite simply to cut down on consumption. Another important component of these measures were incentives in the form of a schedule of rates that could range up to 44 euros per cubic meter, which could be quite discouraging. And finally, there was a communication campaign to heighten awareness among the inhabitants so that they would take it to heart to pay attention to these issues and uphold the recommendations for water consumption and do whatever they could do to preserve the integrity of the overall water system and water services of the city. So on the next slide here, we can see some of the causes. As we have seen, there wasn't enough water, and some substantial steps were taken to lower demand. We saw earlier that we had been at 900,000 cubic meters per day, and that the trough in demand that resulted from this, we were seeing figures of under 600,000 cubic meters per day. Of course, the figures did not remain strictly identical, but the restrictions were only lifted very gradually as the situation improved. And you can see that there was a minimum of about 20% of filling for the reservoirs. And then it was only very gradually over time, thanks to this lasting lowering in demand, that the level of the reservoirs was able to gradually edge back up. And the city authorities realized that their approach until then had not been necessarily relevant or able to provide enough water safety. So they decided to think afresh about supply and demand for water, to increase the surface and underground resources, to proceed with desalination, reuse waste water. Desalination was very useful since the city is right by the sea, but of course reusing wastewater was a very positive contribution, whether for irrigation or for some industrial applications. The authorities also realized that some plants had been taking hold on the slopes around the watersheds, and that there was a need for better watershed management. So on the next slide, we can see here some of the root causes for the disaster. I'd like to highlight 5 of these, 5 main ones. First of all, water resources that are used both for city uses and for other uses, such as agriculture. Now, agricultural use increases markedly during the dry season, and perhaps there was an underestimation for those years. In fact, there is more agricultural demand for water, while at the same time the reserves are already lower. So that leads to higher levels of risk that have to be factored into overall management. Secondly, relatively quick population growth, which means that you have to think ahead constantly so that you have enough of a buffer to be able to meet the needs. The third point has to do with watershed management, as I was mentioning, where perhaps not enough attention had been paid to actually taking advantage of every single drop of water available in the watershed. So steps were taken to remedy that problem. There was a fourth point, which was not initially quite as clear to everyone, although there had been plans for some time to have rate or fee structure that would provide incentives. The problem which arose was that some of the population was poor, and that was a factor that slowed down the rollout of this fee schedule. The schedule applied did not provide sufficient incentives or disincentives, and so ultimately consumption was higher than what had been estimated, and this left the authorities with less room for maneuver. But the most critical point is the last one, namely depending on a single resource, namely surface waters, and thus depending on rainfall ultimately, so that if it so happens that for several years in a row there is relatively low rainfall, this can compromise the overall equilibrium. And this is what ultimately led the Cape to change its policy and manage its resources differently. 2 minutes left, Michel. 2 minutes only, my gosh. Well, I was going to talk about Windhoek because it's a fairly important city in a semi-desertic area with an expanding population, many poor people, with an increasing share of poor people and limited resources. So what Windhoek has been doing for several decades now, in fact, is reusing treated wastewater, not just for irrigation or for the needs of a cement factory, but also to directly reuse this processed wastewater as drinking water. And this enables aquifer recharge to occur through infiltration during the more abundant years. So this has worked well. However, if you look forward to 2060, some recent studies have shown that there could be an approximately 30% drop in rainfall. If we look back to what was happening in the Cape, the situation with changes in the climate were of a nature that also concerned Namibia, so that Windhoek was forced to draw more and more water, or was going to be forced to do so, from the aquifer. And this will no doubt lead Windhoek to reuse more and more wastewater, and thus to have to do some additional processing with reverse osmosis to avoid increasing salinity in this loop and also in the water table. In conclusion, the first point is that we need to look ahead at the impact of climate change on rainfall. All too often, we only look at past statistics, which are unable to highlight these future developments, and we need to think about those prospects and available resources in this respect. It's also important to look at conventional and non-conventional resources so that there can be solutions when difficulties arise. There's also another important, perhaps somewhat lateral point, making sure that institutions and services are structured and organized in such a way as to enable the overall system to be managed properly, which is not necessarily always a given. Then you have to reduce water demand, water losses, needless to say, because every time you avoid wasting water, then you're feeding it back into the system and meeting the needs better. There's a sociological factor as well. You have to take account of the characteristics of the population, including the less well-off segment of the population, and you have to promote awareness campaigns. But of course, this calls for constantly renewed efforts. It's interesting in this connection to look at what the city of Singapore has been able to do in the space of some 40 years. It has reduced its reliance on conventional resources by some 40%. And this is an example of how it is actually possible to reduce your reliance on resources such as rainfall and find other alternative solutions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michel, for your presentation. The floor is now open to the Q&A question and answer session. And there were some questions on the chat. And I will first start by one of the first questions, which was about the first presentation. And this is one of my question of mine. I was wondering about the en français? Ah, okay. Bien, en français alors.
Right, so asking the question in French. My first question is on the indicators that you used at the beginning to assess poverty. The question is how many of those, regardless of the relation you did, how many of those were already in relation with water? Were some of them related to water, or did you establish that link later on? Now, as I said at the very beginning, we had 45 variables used to calculate the poverty index. Already among those variables, there was access to water, access to drinking water, sewage systems, etc., other criteria that were related to water. And this was the first step. So we were able to calculate the poverty index, which is the consumption per capita. And once we had done that, then we were very much sensitive to the question of how this was related to water. That was the second step, and it was a completely separate study too. But the tools, the mathematical methods that were used in the first step to calculate poverty later allowed us to conduct the second study on the correlation between poverty and water. So you really need to look at these things as two separate things. First, I looked at the poverty map because we had to in order to better understand how very quickly, I mean, I did this very quickly, briefly. You can do an entire presentation on how we calculated it, how the tool evolved, and I really want Egypt to have full independence in terms of poverty. But it's a second study that was conducted first on the correlation between water and poverty, but second, because we wanted to insist on the idea of forecasting, simulation and forecasting. It wasn't simply on saying we looked at this and that and we concluded this and that. The idea is to prevent by forecasting. Thank you for your reply.
I checked the question I noticed during the presentation. So there was one about the second presentation, which was about the first, it's not the first question was asked, but the one I have on my eyes. What is the time scale of response of the operating? No, it's not the one I wanted to say. Can you go back? Because I've tried to find the question. Yes, I found the question. How do you combine this is for the second speakers. How do you combine the action promoted through structural and non-structural measure within the natural infrastructure that you propose and social participation in the face of climate change? I don't know if you can see the question on your screen.
Oui, oui, tout à fait. Du coup, ça s'adresse à Anita et moi, hein, je pense, c'est ça?
Oui,
Right, I believe this question is for Anita and myself. Yes, so I started answering via the chat. As I said, the idea of the city of Paris was to try and provide responses and solutions to adapt the infrastructure as well as to lead to change in behaviors and lifestyles because of climate change and how it's already affecting us. So I tried to give a few elements of response in the chat, such as, for example, a lot of awareness raising information sessions, communication campaigns, advocacy, trainings, urban pathways to show how climate change is affecting our lives in the city, as well as heat island and the effect on water, and how it will impact our management of public spaces, our management of buildings as well, and the way that we will have to adapt to all of that. And so we have determined, along with other partners as well, such as the Agence Parisienne pour le Climat, the Parisian Agency for Climate, a certain number of recommendations. We communicate on these recommendations, try to circulate them, such as, for example, how to maintain a certain level of freshness in your apartment without having to use AC, try to protect yourself against heat, protect the most vulnerable people as well living around you. There's also something that I haven't mentioned, but it's the new illnesses, the new diseases that are appearing. This is something that we had already started implementing before the pandemic. We were working already on, for example, the new types of mosquitoes arriving in Paris. The city dwellers of Paris are not necessarily used to how to prevent these specific kinds of mosquitoes, to prevent them from living in on balconies and in our plants and reproducing there. So how can we help them not feel too welcome in our homes, and communicate as well on how these mosquitoes develop, of course, because they can be responsible for certain diseases, namely chikungunya, for example. On the question of water resources, yes, this is also something that's keeping us busy. But maybe Anita will have a few more things to say about that. It's true that in Paris, for now, we're not really having to face, of course, water is something in Paris that's almost magical, culturally speaking. You know, you turn on the tap and the water comes. So we're not really used to being aware of the precious aspect of water and how scarce a resource it can be. Anita, maybe you have something to add. Yes, I wanted to speak of the permis de végétaliser. It's a license to grow plants, and it's a way of participating to the citizen action. Citizen action, it's a possibility for Parisians to use the space, use the city in their own way by growing plants inside the city, and then they have to be in charge of their plants. The question is also raised of knowing how you demineralize the city with these actions. We are currently working, for example, at access to non-drinking water so that these spaces can be watered, these plants can be watered with non-drinking water in Paris. It's another way of raising awareness on the importance of water. In Paris, we are very lucky to have two water systems, one that's drinking water, the other that's non-drinking water for growing plants. It's taken directly from the canal. So it's a good way of informing people on the use of these two types of water, drinking water, non-drinking water, in the Parisian network. And as Julie was saying, in Paris, we are very fortunate enough to not have to worry about a resource that's still available in abundant quantities, which is also rather cheap compared to other cities. So it's a challenge too to raise awareness around people who have to be more aware of the importance of water. People pay for their water within what they pay for rent, for example. And so we are not very much aware of what we pay when we pay for water. It's part of a package, a real estate package. So there are lots of things that place, lots of actions that place water back to the heart of what we know about the environment. It's definitely a challenge. There's, for example, citizen mobilization, cleaning operations that are also opportunities for us to work on the relationship between Eau de Paris and the people. They also have awareness-raising events for the general public. Also on raising awareness on drinking tap water instead of bottled water. It's another series of ideas that we can have in order to recreate, rekindle the flame between the Eau de Paris, the supplier, and the Parisian people.
And you also answered another question about the implication of population within the solution you proposed. So I have a question for the next speaker. Can you hear us?
Yeah,
Marcus?
I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. So you mentioned during your presentation the way you use model, but I was wondering about when we face climate change, we face more intensive rain event with some dry periods. And I was wondering how you take into account the efficiency of the nature-based solution if the drought period is very long and could alter the efficiency of the nature-based solution. So how do you take this into account?
So the first goal of this model was to enhance the design of bioretentions for flooding. So what you're saying me is that what if we consider the dry periods, right? So here in this particular model, we're not looking for continuous simulations. We are just looking for specific intense storms for the design. But if you're looking for dry periods, you need to, first of all, in this model, you need to have a better evapotranspiration model in this particular model that we have. If we have a 12-hour storm, evapotranspiration is almost neglectable. So first, you need to consider evapotranspiration, and also you need to have another goal, because for flooding, you just need to focus in critical storms. But for dry periods, you need to think in another thing. For example, use the water for reuse. You can store this water, you can have a better design to capture the whole rainfall to use this water for consumption. But here we are only looking for flooding.
Thank you for your answer. And when you presented your approach with reservoir, the different type of infiltration, in your model, when you apply your model to the entire city, do you take into account the association of different nature-based solutions, or you are taking them into account separately?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, you have two types of modeling. You can simulate the whole watershed with different biorotations in the catchment, connecting each other. We have a software, a free software to do that nowadays, which is the stormwater managed model. In this particular one that we designed, the problem that we are facing is, first of all, we identified a particular area to implement a system, and we are looking to design only this particular system. We're not looking to the connection through the whole catchment. We're just looking for my specific house. If I want to build a bioretention in my house, that's how you can do that. But you're right, maybe in this phase of the model, we are not looking for the whole catchment. We're looking only for our specific area.
There was another question about your presentation. Xiao Song Tang was wondering about the use of your model for more large urban water bodies.
Yeah, so here I just showed the case in a rooftop, right? But since we have all the models applicable for different types of watershed, you can use that easily for a 2 square kilometer watershed. You can use for a 10 hectares watershed. The only issue that you need to consider is the instability of the model, which is another question from Juan Julio. He asked also about the instability of the model. So if you have a different watershed, first you need to check if the model is stable, and then you calculate the time step you need in the model, and then you start the model. But there's no limitation for a specific watershed as far as you have the parameters.
Thank you. So I have a question for Michel Laforgue, so I will ask this question in French. À un moment, Michel, quand tu évoques
Michel, you were mentioning the solutions that were proposed in Cape Town in terms of new water resources. You mentioned the use of groundwater. Isn't there a risk because of the length of their drought session that the renewal of groundwater isn't done sufficiently fast, and so that in addition to exhausting or depleting the resources of the reservoirs, they also deplete the resources of the groundwater? Yeah, this is specifically why they're trying to diversify on non-conventional resources. In the approach, it's not specifically the groundwater that's refueling the dams. It's actually looking at another solution and use these resources as potential resources in order to avoid using or double use of solution. Of course, when you dig into the groundwater in a situation of drought or low rainfall, it's the exact same thing as depleting the dams. It's the same water resource. So, of course, it's a real problem on these conventional resources. And I believe the real solution is, well, there are several solutions. Several solutions were considered before the crisis, and desalination was one of them, of course. Groundwater, for now, is more of a problem than a solution. In many cities worldwide, groundwaters are overused rather than underused. And this should keep increasing as a problem. The groundwater is reloaded with the excess that's available, but this excess is going to be decreasing, and therefore this system is going to have to stop at some point. But of course, yes, it's true that groundwater is not necessarily the ideal solution. Can you hear me? Did you get that? Yes, sorry, I forgot to turn my mic back on. So another question for you, Michel, on the reuse of treated used water and the awareness for population. Do you believe that this can be exported? Yes, I believe it can be done, and Cape Town, I believe it was a real trauma to have 50 liters per day per capita. It was a real shortage with pricings and many, many restrictions. And therefore, I believe that when you face this type of situation, the population is very much aware of things, very much open to changes, at least for a few years. So yes, they could be sensitive to this, maybe not for drinking water, as Emilio was suggesting, and that would be the ultimate solution, but at least for non-household usages, for example, gardens and parks, and many examples would allow us to reduce the amount of water that's taken from waterways. It's a possibility. Two more questions. The first one for you, Hala. You partially answered earlier. You developed a model. Did you hear back from local authorities on the use of this model as a tool for them to better handle these problems? Oh, that's a very easy answer. We work directly with the local authorities. So whether the model that we conceived on poverty or other models, we created this directly with the CAPMAS, which is the Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, which is the equivalent of the French INSEE. So you see, we work hand in hand with the country, otherwise it would never work. So there you have it. Yes, we as soon as we design these types of models, we work with a public partner at any time. Right, thank you very much. Well, my last question is for Julie and Anita. Regarding the shade and the shade plan, what is the goal in terms of land area that you were aiming for? Or is it simply, the idea is simply to identify specific areas, or are you going to do very specific local testings and then maybe spread the idea to a larger scale? Well, I didn't spend too much time on that in my presentation because we're actually still working on the Plan Ombre, the shade plan. We are currently determining, for example, the amount, the number of areas, the scope. We will have different types of systems, canvases above certain streets, but also sort of floating sort of umbrellas in the streets, in schoolyards, or parks or gardens that are very much exposed to the sunshine and cannot be shaded by trees. So on the question you asked me, we are aiming for a dozen of shade areas per year. Those we tested are surface areas of about 100 square meter, and that's an average, because depending on the types of sites, depending on the specific sites as well, we'll have to adapt, of course. But that's the general idea. The first launches should be next summer. So end of May of this year will be the beginning of the launchings, and then we'll have an agenda all the way to summer 2026. Many thanks for this answer.
To close this first part of the session, so I would like to thank first the speakers for the quality of their presentation and the different examples they presented. And I'll give the floor to François.
Oh, sorry, my micro doesn't work. Thank you very much, Mr. Moyer, and all speakers for the very interesting presentation. Thank you, dear participants, for your attention and interest. But stay online. 3 more parallel sessions will start at 4 p.m. to discuss planning tools, technical and technological solutions, and regional session on Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Water. It's vital to human life, our economy, and ecosystem. The very survival of our planet. But water challenges are growing more intense than ever before. Increasingly volatile weather patterns fueled by climate change, crumbling infrastructure, pollution, and overpopulation that's causing a surge in demand for water. But now, new technologies are offering bold new ways to protect and optimize water, to help the world become water secure, and Xylem is leading the way. Xylem is a Fortune 1000 global water technology provider, dedicated to solving water and smart infrastructure challenges. We have a century-long track record of trust and reliability, providing leading-edge technologies, expertise in equipment to utilities, industrials, and other users of water, working closely with our customers to develop solutions that manage water more effectively and efficiently all across the water cycle. Now, we're leading the digital transformation of water, partnering with our customers and innovation leaders, discovering new ways to harness the power of data and analytics, delivering unprecedented insight that's optimizing existing water systems, and creating a future that's more water efficient to meet the world's water needs, and more energy efficient to protect the environment. Our commitment to sustainability is fundamental to our business strategy, guiding everything from how we design new products to our culture and people. Through our corporate social responsibility program, Watermark, Xylem employees have volunteered more than 230,000 hours over the past 5 years, educating about key water issues, cleaning up local waterways, working with our NGO partners to deliver drinkable water systems to communities in urgent need, and deploying our experts, technology and equipment to help disaster-afflicted communities. The world's water challenges are dramatically increasing, but so are the possibilities to solve them. Xylem is working every day to bring water technology and innovation to communities and people around the globe, raising awareness and reaching new audiences through partnerships and the power of sports, and helping create a world where water is more accessible, affordable, and safer for all. Water is always moving, and so are we. We're pushing forward, pursuing the opportunity of a lifetime. We're Xylem, and we're solving water. Join us.